Hi, everyone, and welcome to our latest edition of ELI on Air, the ELI Talks weekly interactive broadcast in which we speak to interesting folks from across the Jewish spectrum about ideas of Jewish engagement, literacy, and identity. My name is Miriam Brousseau, and I'm the program director of ELI Talks, and I'm really thrilled to be able to offer this edition to you in partnership with our friends over at the Israel Forever Foundation and at the Jewish Week. So with that, I am going to, in a moment, just turn it over to our moderator, Esther Kostanowitz, who's going to be leading this conversation today on In Love and War, Israel, Family, and the Phenomenon of the Lone Soldiers, with our guest, Michael Hoffman, who is the CEO of C3 Communications. But to kick us off, I'll just remind everyone that these conversations are totally interactive. You're welcome to submit your questions and ideas right here through the video, and we'll also be keeping an eye on the Twitter feed using hashtag EliTalks to submit your questions and ideas. And we'll be on air for the next half hour or so, having this very interesting conversation about Jewish identity, American Jewish identity, and Zionism. So thank you again to everyone for joining us today, and with that, I will hand it over to Esther K. to kick us off.
Thanks, Miriam. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Very pleased to be speaking with Michael Hoffman today from C3 Communications, whose daughter, who's 19, is a lone soldier in the Israeli Defense Forces. And I don't know about the rest of you out there in TV land and Eli Talks land, but I know for me, I never really even heard of the term lone soldier, Chayal Boded, or Chayelet Bodeda. Which one is it? Do you know, Michael?
I think it's Chayala Bodedet.
Chayala Bodedet. Okay.
So Bodeda. Maybe that's right.
Chayelet Bodeda. Okay. We're learning Hebrew today at Eli Talks also, which is super fun. So anyway, I had never really heard of the term lone soldier, but it does make perfect sense now that I've heard it several times in the last couple of weeks. Unfortunately, for not such great reasons, because we've lost a number of lone soldiers in the recent violence in the region. So I just wanted to ask you if you could tell us a little bit more about about your family background and how your daughter became a lone soldier, and maybe include in there a little bit of an explanation of what your sense of being a lone soldier is like from what your daughter has told you.
Thanks. Well, I'm glad to be here. So, the idea behind a lone soldier is somebody who moves to Israel to serve in the Israel Defense Forces, but has no family in Israel. So that's the lone part of being a soldier. And I think it's only been in the last maybe 10 years or so where there's been a real recognition that those folks need some additional support. So there's been a bunch of programs that have been created to help them, to give them some extra benefits, to really make sure that they're cared for there. And we certainly had that feeling like that there was a lot of people looking after them. So, for us, my daughter graduated high school last May of 2013. She spent that summer working at a camp, and then came home in August a year ago for a week or so, and then she was on the Nefesh B'Nefesh Aliyah flight to Israel with other new Olim, people moving to Israel, and she was among, I think, somewhere in the 300-ish range of lone soldiers, of young people going to Israel by themselves who were going to join the army. And the really nice thing was that she's in this program called Garin Sabar, which is run by the Israel Scouts. And what they do is realize that it's good to have a support group when you do something like this. And so they get groups of these people together the year before they go, and they meet several weekends throughout the year in the U.S., and they get to know each other. They get to talk about all kinds of things they're going to deal with and emotional things. And then when they move, that group of, let's say, 20 to 30 all moves to the same kibbutz, where they live in their own housing on the kibbutz, but they're all adopted by different families that live on the kibbutz. So different kibbutzim in Israel participate in this program, and my daughter's kibbutz is Ein Dor, which is in the north outside of Afula, and so she moved with this group from the Midwest in August. And then they do different group things there at the beginning of the program. They start an Ulpan, so for kids who don't have any Hebrew skills or have weak Hebrew skills, they start learning Hebrew. And then, and then kids that will, then they start to do testing. So they move to Israel together, but they don't join the army together. They all do different kinds of testing individually, and then they decide where they're going to be in the army. Basically, after they do, Israel does a tremendous amount of testing for young people, a lot of testing for young people about how they, their physical skills, their emotional readiness, their intelligence, and then the Army gives them some choices around which jobs to take. So my daughter went through this, and then there was some delay, and she joined the Army in March.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I've recently read this article in the Jewish Week about how in this past August the Aliyah flights that for people who made Aliyah this last August that there were 108 lone soldiers and half of them are women, which is really quite an interesting statistic because a lot of people don't think of the Army as a very male environment. And I'm wondering if your daughter has been able to report anything to you or has shared anything with you about the role of women in as lone soldiers.
Yeah, and that number of 108 was just on that flight. I think there was many more times that in terms of total number that went. But I was worried about that. I've heard stories from friends who are my age, about being who are Israelis or who grew up in Israel who were drafted, and there's jokes about the Israeli women serve in the army. They serve coffee, and jokes about just a lack of seriousness, things like sexual harassment, those kind of things. So I was concerned about that. My daughter was not, and her experience so far is the opposite of that. She has had and is having a tremendous experience in the Army. One that I would say is characterized by seriousness and respect, and she's been very impressed. Certainly, she's seen some things related to the bureaucracy of the Army, which I think any giant institution you're going to have those kinds of things. But overall, her experience has been really positive. I guess that has something to do with the jobs that you get, right? So different jobs you are trained for, which means you're in different training, you're going to go to different places, you're with different people. And so my guess is that experience has some range to it depending on the job. The job that my daughter got in the Army that she's doing now is as a basic training commander, which is sort of seems strange and kind of bizarre, but she, because she's 19 years old and she's basically being the commander in basic training for 18-year-olds who are just joining the Army. So her training was a standard basic training, and then that everybody gets at a certain level, and then specific training on how to be a commander of newbies who are going into the Army.
Well, I think the newbies are probably very lucky to have your daughter commanding them. So that's probably something she's experiencing. I hope that they're being nice to her. Although she doesn't really, as the commander, she's the one who decides who's nice to whom. So I'm sure she's terrific in that role. Yeah. But I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about your daughter's educational background and upbringing. When we spoke just briefly before the call started, you mentioned that she had what you would consider a Zionist upbringing, and that if you're going to raise your kids with a Zionist upbringing, you kind of can't be surprised when they move to Israel. and want to join the Army. So I'm hoping you can say a little bit more about that, why it was important for you to have that kind of upbringing for your daughter, and whether at any point during this process you have said to yourself, oh, maybe it shouldn't have been that Zionist an upbringing, maybe it should be better off if she were here, to kind of explain a little bit about the about that tension between like loving Israel and also fearing for your child's perhaps well-being,
Right.
and also just the distance. Even in times when there's no war, the distance can be a considerable challenge to people.
Yeah, so we, I grew up in a house that was a Zionist home, and that I was taught to think of Israel as a Jewish safe haven and as an important place in history where there is a Jewish state. And when I was in at some point. When my daughter was very young, when she was 2, I made the decision, my wife and I made the decision to move to Israel. We didn't make Aliyah, we didn't change our status. We went to sort of see how it went with no preconditions about how long we would stay. And we stayed for a few years, and my daughter, Dory, who's now in the Army, got the opportunity to be in preschool in Israel, which is the best school in Israel, is preschool in Israel. So there's a lot of issues around the Israel educational system that Israelis will tell you about, but the preschools are phenomenal and really terrific. And so she had this really unique experience, I think, because we moved back when she was going in the 1st grade. And so she came here and went to Jewish day school till she was in 8th grade, and then went to public high school. But her Israel experience was preschool, and preschool is the best. So for her, I think all those subsequent years, Israel was not a complicated story. Israel was a magical place, where things were simple in some way. And she knew intellectually, of course, about Israel and its complications, but I think emotionally it was all positive and for her. And I think that certainly had something to do with her decision. That she carried that great emotional, positive thing. I think she's the oldest of my kids. My other kids didn't have that experience, so I think that how they'll react, would they do the same thing? I think it's a lot less likely, but it's possible. And as we saw, I think with one of the lone soldiers who was killed in the Gaza war recently, was somebody who didn't grow up with any of this at all, and sort of discovered Israel through birthright. And so I think we never know what experience people will have and what it is about that will get them, excited. I remember when I decided to move to Israel, I was in law school, and I had to drop out of law school to move to Israel. And I remember sitting with my parents and saying, I had to tell them in person. They were living near their grandchild. I was living in Baltimore, where I'm from. And I sat them down, and they're like, what is this all about? Why did you need to have us here? And my dad thought of the craziest thing. I had just started law school. I was a year in law school, and he thought of the craziest thing he could think of. He's like, what, you're going to move to Israel? And I was like, yes, we're going to move to Israel. And they thought that was the craziest, most ridiculous thing ever. They ended up, totally supporting us, but they could not believe that was going to happen. And I think there is something to that you raise kids to believe in the state. And what I remember feeling in my younger self was the idea that the state of Israel didn't exist for a couple thousand years, and it exists now. And here I am in this play in history, and have the opportunity to either be a bystander to that or to be someone who's in that. And I think that's really exciting, and I think that captures the imagination of young people, and is something that would get them there. And just one other thing, I think. I think it's really positive that that someone like my daughter and some of the other folks who are moving, come from and bring some of the values that we get from the American experience. Some of the values of democracy, some of the values of equality, and I think that's a positive thing for Israel too. I think the influence of Americans can be a really positive thing for the state.
You said that you had to drop out of law school in order to go to Israel, and I'm wondering, obviously, dropping out of law school is like one of those, primal Jewish sins. Not as bad as dropping out of medical school, but still. And so I'm wondering, like, why that opportunity came up for you, and why you decided to move ahead with it in a time when you were really starting to form your professional or a potential road for your professional identity. Right. What was that decision like for you?
Well, I think it was just a lot of different circumstances. I think one was just the feeling of the law school path felt very clear, which was I was going to graduate law school with a lot of debt and would need to practice law, which wasn't that interesting to me. I enjoyed law school and I liked the thinking part of law school, but I was not interested in being a corporate lawyer. But I thought, with the kind of debt that I would have when I graduated, I would have no choice, but to go into that path. And then what was happening at the time that I moved was the internet was just getting started and ramping up. And I had friends in Israel who were starting internet companies. And there are a lot of people who don't realize this, but a lot of the really important internet technologies came out of Israel and are still coming out of Israel. So we're seeing tremendous innovation and technology come out of Israel. And so I had friends who were telling me at that time, wow, it's an incredible environment to do business. It's amazing what's happening with this internet thing. And it was also, I think, a fairly optimistic time from a peace perspective. I think the internet, that time, those early days, the internet, it was the early Oslo days. It was, a sense of possibility, a sense that the world was changing and everything was possible, and I was excited by that.
Thanks. I know a lot of people who were there during that time, the tech kind of startup, the beginning of that scene, and it has been, consistently, Israel has been like a real place of opportunity for those kinds of ideas to flourish. I'm just wondering, in terms of the re-entry, the coming back. That's something that, like, I know my friends in Israel always talk about, the ones who live there permanently. They always talk about how every year there's like people who come and they love them and they get used to them and they hang out with them and then they go back. Yeah. So your daughter is, as a lone soldier, has committed to being there. She's made Aliyah. So the question of, like, how you and the family that's here in the States are dealing with the distance. Obviously, some of those internet companies perhaps are making your connections easier now, which is an interesting kind of a really nice symmetry or symbolism or whatever. But I'm wondering, do you ever feel like that there's a pull for you to go back there? I know you said you have 2 other kids. Have you been to visit her? Have you seen what her life is like there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have 3 other kids, and I did see what her life was like there. I was there in July, and at the end of July, and got to went to her Army base and was there for her graduation from her Army course, and really got to taste what her life there is like, and it's amazing, and she's really enjoying it. There's no question that the technology has made it easier to be distant. People who moved to Israel in the 60s and the 70s, I mean, you were not in touch. You had those little airmail letters, that you had to write, and you just had very little contact. And even people my age who served in the Army, people who served in the Army 20 years ago, they didn't have any of this internet stuff and smartphones. And when you were in the Army, you were in the Army. You were not, maybe you could get to a payphone, but you were in the Army, basically, and not connected. The difference today is incredible. Where my daughter is, she has access to her iPhone. not all day, but at some point during the day, pretty much, unless they're out in the field, or doing some kind of, multi-day exercise, which basically means I can chat with her. I can, WhatsApp is our social connection thing of choice. Send pictures, talk. We have group, family conversations there, and that makes it, I think, a lot easier. Certainly for me, I think it also makes it a lot easier for her. At one point earlier this year, her phone broke, and she, was without this connection for a while, and it was hard. She was definitely cut off and felt, that silence. And I think, when you're a lone soldier, that connection, it means a lot.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I've noticed that as my awareness that there is such an entity as a lone soldier has become greater. Also, it's parallel to my knowledge that there are support structures for those lone soldiers, and so I think that's a very nice thing. It's not, oh, poor lone soldiers. It's, there are lone soldiers, and here's the support system for them. So I'm sure that as a parent, that makes you feel a little bit better about her being in a quote unquote foreign country, which isn't really even a foreign country because you're so familiar with it. Right. It's not, maybe it's not as scary to you as for maybe some of these other parents whose kid went on birthright and had a transformative experience, and then the next year is all of a sudden in the Army. It's a little bit.
Question that I feel comfortable with that, and just to tell parents about another incentive for having their kids do this. One of the incentives for the lone soldier, and that my daughter will qualify for, is that she can go to any Israeli university after this experience for free that she can get into. So, with the way college costs are in the United States and the way there's excellent higher education in Israel, that's an incredible benefit. Which is obviously not the reason that she would go and do that, but it certainly makes the idea of, hey, I can actually start a life there this way, and I have the means. The state and private philanthropists are going to give me the opportunity to make that real. So that's really just tremendous.
One of the things that I've found, I said to you before we started the call, that my brother and sister-in-law and two nephews just went back to Israel after they were randomly here for the entirety of this most recent spate of violence. So even though obviously I have a lot of family there in Israel, friends, of course, as you should look for me to become about 400% more invested in what happens in the region. And I think that one of the things that's been, and I don't know if that math pans out, so not my area of expertise, but the one thing that I've been confused and stymied about, and I think that maybe you can help just from a media knowledge perspective, is how much as a parent and as somebody who's involved in a communications firm, how do you sort out the media messages from what you're hearing from your daughter to what you're hearing about the conflict, about the soldiers and serving, and all of those kinds of influences that come in from other places that can be extremely worrisome, confusing, conflicting. I have friends who are, if you want to call them both sides of the conflict. I don't necessarily like that polarity, but I have friends who are more right-wing and more left-wing, and all of them are posting their sources. And what do you listen to? Where do you go? And how do you deal with that when you have somebody you love who's over there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just to start out, that the fact that my daughter is not in a combat role and that her job actually exists on an Army base gives me a certain more relaxed sense, about whatever's going on there. That she's not in a position to deploy, somewhere. Though, a feeling in a small country often, certainly when there's terrorism, is that it's very random and nobody's safe. But she's not going to Gaza. She's not going to be in that combat role. And I think that for parents, mostly of the boys who are primarily going into those combat roles, that creates a whole nother layer of anxiety that I don't have. So, I can't speak exactly to that, but I would just say, I was just there in July, and it was right in the middle of this with the rockets falling and everything. And, I think that it's like anywhere, when you see it firsthand and you're there, you have a much more relaxed sense than when you just hear things. So it's like Chicago, there was, in one weekend in Chicago, 50 people were shot this summer. So you could start to talk about Chicago. Well, I'm in Chicago, so, but I don't feel the danger in Chicago, right? Because a lot of that is localized in certain places that I'm not, and for whatever other reason. And I think that that's true in Israel as well. There's a sense of, for the most part, of when you experience something firsthand. So with the rockets falling, Israel has this incredible Iron Dome system that shoots down the rockets over populated areas, and it's, and maybe that gives a false sense of safety, but I felt I didn't feel under threat there, and I think that neither did, my daughter takes it very seriously, of course, but I think just in terms of that physical threat, luckily not feeling that.
Thank you. I'm just one of these people who fixates on the media of things sometimes. So I'm wondering, I know for me, I woke up this morning to a text alert from Haaretz telling me that there had been rockets, as well as a note from Twitter informing me that five of the people I follow are tweeting about Israel. And I have to argue it's more than that. But the fact is that this is part of my morning wake-up routine. As I wake up and I see what's happened in the intervening hours that I've managed to catch of sleep. And I'm just wondering if you can share with us a little bit about what your process is for getting this information.
Right.
Do you check in with her regularly, or do you? I'm sure you do, but like if there's a schedule for both the messages from the media and the messages from the personal side of things.
That's a good point, and I think we have to filter those things, right? It depends on people are, there's a lot of research about how people live in their own bubble, and how a Facebook news feed just sends you the things that you want to hear, basically, and the algorithm manipulates that, and we only read news sources that we agree with. So we can get trapped in this kind of bubble where we're experiencing only one piece. I think for me, I try to certainly stay engaged with the big headlines, and then dig into things that are specific, or that I would have a specific interest in. But I try not to obsess about the news. I know that I can't do anything about it. That I'm, I don't need to hear about where every rocket landed, and I think part of my, I can't say, but I think that the fact that I can text my daughter and pretty much hear from her pretty much every day makes me feel like much more relaxed about, well, if something's going on, she'll tell me, that something's going on. So I do feel that connection makes it easier for me to see the news at a higher level and not obsess about it.
That's very wise counsel. I still find myself very overwhelmed by the media and wanting to really support my friends who, like I say, do have differing opinions, and I feel like experiencing things outside of my normal bubble is also making things a lot more complicated. Frankly, it's much much easier to be in an echo chamber where it's only the in an echo chamber where it's only like the voices you're used to hearing or the opinions that you'd like to hear. But I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what I don't think it's been referred to as the diaspora dilemma, but it is kind of the way I'm terming it right now, which is that if you have a connection to Israel and you feel invested in what happens there, the question of how important it is to be either a supporter abroad or a resident within Israel, and how important the physical presence of you in the state of Israel is important to how you see yourself as a Zionist.
Right.
The question that kind of comes out of that is, does your daughter love Israel more than you because she is in the army?
Well, I don't think so, but I think there is definitely a dilemma about there's certainly a school of thought in Israel that has said always, if you care about Israel, you should be here, and it sort of negates the diaspora. There are thinkers today, I think, who are really pushing back on that in Israel. So, for example, Gidi Greenstein, who did a terrific ELI talk about his new book called Flexigidity, which I highly recommend checking out. He talks about how important the diaspora has been to Jewish survival historically, and how diversity in the diaspora feeds the Jewish people, and how the Jewish community needs to support diversity in the diaspora, which I think is a really different view for an Israeli that where traditionally coming out of Israel was, if you want to have any meaning in the modern Jewish world, you got to be in Israel, and that bleeds over obviously into the whole question of politics and opinions, which is if you live in New York, you can't say anything about what Israel's doing, in Gaza because you're not here and you're not experiencing it. And I have always rejected that notion. I think that as supporters of a place, as people who care about the future of a place, it's not only your right, but it's your obligation to speak up, to say what you think, to believe in the country, but also advocate for what you think is in the country's best interest. And for me as a liberal and progressive, I've been told to shut up about Israel many times, and I really reject that. But I also have certainly have a lot of respect for what my daughter is doing, and feel like the perspective of being there is different. So it doesn't mean it's sort of one thing or the other, but I think these are all things that live in kind of messy, the messy world that we have, and we have to navigate all of it.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's right. I think those of us who are here and there periodically, and sometimes in our heart there when we hear about problems in the region and wish that we could get on a plane, while a part of us is saying, don't get on a plane. So it's, I think that there's like a lot of that tension at work. In addition, the fact that there is so much, and this is kind of like a topic for another day, but there's so much growing anti-Israel sentiment, which has been translated as anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic sentiment in cities across the world, really, that if all of the people in those regions move to Israel, they might feel a little bit more safe in terms of going out in the streets and being Jewish overtly. However, I think that the fact that there are Jews living in these places kind of forces the local communities to deal with the fact that there are Jews, and it brings attention to the tensions in the community, which I think we can all agree are not great, especially in places where there's been a lot of violence or anti-Jewish rhetoric that has come up. But I think that
all of that news coming out of Europe in particular has been extremely troubling. I mean, and really heartbreaking. And it's certainly easier to sort of be all the way on one side or all the way on the other side of anything, right? And so for those of us who straddle some of these issues and some of these worlds, it's a much harder place to be in. But that's the ground I've staked out for myself.
And I think that's also holy ground. So I think that's a great place to kind of wrap things up. And I know Miriam Brasso, ELI Talks Program Director, is back to take us home. So take it away, Miriam.
Awesome. Well, we'll close with holy work and good big ideas. And I do encourage everyone to check out both Gidi Greenstein's ELI Talk and also one called A Tale of Two Zions, given by Michel Sion, which also really nicely addresses this tension between Israel and America, and how and where do you show that kind of support. So with that, thank you so much, Michael, for joining us and being our guest today and sharing your family story. And thank you to Esther for being a fabulous moderator and bringing your own personal experience into this whole conversation. Really grateful to everyone for coming in and watching. We'll be back again, same time, same place, with more Eli on Air, more inspired Jewish ideas from all kinds of interesting people. And so with that, thank you again for your time and your talent, and we'll see you next week on air. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Miriam. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you.